This is Mr. Hasdovic's World History Online Lecture Series, lecture number 11, The End of the Cold War and the Collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended in much the same way it began, quickly and in such a manner that nobody could have easily predicted. What began shortly after World War II with Stalin's aggressive interest in expanding Soviet Russia's ideologies, what had seen the USA and USSR nearly come to blows that could have started World War III over the Soviet blockade of Berlin, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, what had seen actual wars erupt in Korea, Vietnam, and then Afghanistan over determining whether communism or capitalism, democracy or totalitarianism pervade, had ended very quickly and to most unexpectedly. The Cold War was 34 years old when, in a moment that seemingly caught the whole world by surprise, the Berlin Wall was torn down on November 10, 1989. It was 36 years old when, in 1991, the last Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, had willingly surrendered his power and position to Russians calling for reform and change and democracy. Before many people knew it, and before many could even understand it, the Cold War was over. Not with violence or an all-out war, but with the Soviets deciding simply they didn't want to be the Soviets or a totalitarian socialist society anymore. The Soviets simply abandoned their holdings in Eastern Europe and then abandoned their control over the Soviet Union. Ever since the early 1920s, Americans had lived in abject fear of the USSR, afraid of an invasion, afraid of a nuclear war with the Russians, even afraid of their way of life. To just bow out of the Cold War as the USSR did confused many Americans as much as it had made us ecstatic that we were the apparent winners of the war. Since 1991, the Russians have not been our dire enemy. We no longer feared the spread of communism, and there was no other superpower on earth capable of challenging the economic nor military might of the United States. We have been the sole superpower in the world ever since. But what precisely did happen to the USSR? Why did the Cold War end, and why did it end as it did, with Russia simply calling it quits? Hopefully, you remember to look at the Cold War as a multi-level competition between the USA and USSR. It wasn't just a competition to see who could get to the moon faster or who could possess the most powerful military. It was a political competition to determine which form of government was better, democracy or totalitarianism. It was also an economic competition to determine whether Russia's brand of socialism or the US's relatively free and open capitalistic economy would triumph. By the late 1980s, the winner was clear. Capitalism was the dominant economy, and democracy was the preferred political system. The USSR and the USA were engaged in a decades-long spending race. Which economy could generate more wealth? Based upon the strains the Soviet Union placed upon itself, clearly capitalism was the victor. The first strain the USSR had assumed was having the world's most powerful and largest nuclear arsenal. As you learned in class, the USSR had tested its first atomic weapon in 1949. 6 years later, in 1955, it had 200 such weapons. By 1965, that number expanded to 6,300. 1 decade later, that number increased by nearly 400% to over 23,000 nuclear warheads. By 1985, near the end of the Soviet Union's existence, it had 44,000 nuclear warheads, the most it would ever possess. Now, on average, to simply store and keep one nuclear warhead ready for use costs about $1 million per year. To do so with 44,000 nuclear warheads meant that the USSR was spending over $40 billion each year just on maintaining the nuclear weapons that it had. This placed a tremendous economic burden on the USSR to protect and prepare weapons that it hoped never to use. The USA was largely to blame for Russia's vast nuclear weapons arsenal. We were the first country to develop nuclear weapons, and we therefore had a head start on building up our own arsenal. In 1955, when Russia had only 200 weapons, the U.S. had over 2,200 nuclear warheads, 11 times Russia's arsenal. In 1965, we had nearly 6 times as many warheads as the Russians, 32,400 to the USSR's 6,300. The USSR had been losing the nuclear arms race to the United States well into the 1970s, and the United States had already demonstrated a willingness to use its weapons against enemies in war. By 1990, we conducted almost twice as many nuclear weapons tests as the USSR, and more than the rest of the world combined. If the USSR wanted to avoid being bullied by the USA's nuclear stockpile, if it wanted to deny the US its advantage, Russia had to build up its nuclear arsenal to levels at least as large as our own. In essence, U.S. aggression forced Russia to spend a tremendous amount of money developing and storing its own vast nuclear storehouse, again spending untold billions of dollars on weapons the USSR wouldn't even use. The USSR had isolated itself from the West. It didn't want to have its culture or politics influenced by Western ideas or values. That was one of the main reasons why Stalin conquered and occupied much of Eastern Europe, to keep the West out of Russia. While borders may be effective at blocking the movement of people, they often fail at blocking the movement of ideas. Now, Russia's entire economy was geared toward providing for the wants of the nation and the needs of its people. However, it only functioned poorly at best at providing for its people's wants. There were very few consumer products available to buy in the USSR, and they were often of poor quality. While everyone had a place to live and had at least rudimentary health care provided by the state, they didn't really have board games. They didn't have much variety in the form of fashion, and the only art or music that was available to purchase or listen to on the radio was that which the government approved. Especially for Russian youth, who had either heard from family who had traveled to the West, or had met the rare traveler from the West who got the appropriate clearance to travel in and around the USSR, the West seemed like an exotic land that not only catered to your wants, but had more than enough consumer products to satisfy everyone's wants. Pepsi and Coke, which were forbidden products in the USSR, could cost as much as $25 to $50 per 2-liter bottle on the Russian black market. Not so much because these drinks tasted delicious, but because they were Western and therefore forbidden by the Soviet government. People wanted what they couldn't have. Rumors and legends of a place called McDonald's, which sold delicious meat sandwiches and garnished with something known as a French fry, were the stuff of a Russian's dreams. Rock and roll was a Western and American invention, and as such was not an art form approved by the Soviet Union. Yet smuggled record albums and cassettes could fetch well over $100 each on the black market. Even though they were illegal, many Russian teens knew who the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Clash, Pink Floyd, Billy Joel, and Guns N' Roses were. They either heard music that was smuggled in from the West, or were able to pick up Western radio signals if they lived close enough to Western Europe, or even pirate radio stations from within the USSR. Russians were enamored with Western culture, a culture that seemed to cater to what people wanted instead of what the government decided people needed. And these people wanted more. The USSR could not satisfy Russia's wants, only the West could do that. And if Russia wouldn't westernize willingly, its people would make it do so in other fashions. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, some of the first things that slipped inside its borders were Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Rock music and its touring musicians, such as Paul McCartney, Billy Joel, and Metallica, all of whom performed in the USSR within a year of the Soviet Union's collapse. And Russia's first McDonald's would open in the capital city of Moscow in 1990, 1 year before the Soviet Union collapsed.